So this is week 3. It's called Take an Outside View of our Handbook for New Stoics, How to Thrive in a World Out of Your Control. And this really focuses on sympathy versus empathy. And what I found so interesting about it is it kind of flips the idea of empathy on its head, in that we talk a lot about empathy and you got to empathize with everybody else. But as they point out in this lesson is, in doing so, you do so more for people that you know. So it's easier to empathize with friends and family, even someone at work or a stranger that you know a little bit, than it is if you read a news story and something bad happened to someone who lives in your city. You're like, oh, okay. So the point in that is the sympathy part is the real part. There was that line in here I have to find. Empathy is ethically problematic, as he adds. As with all highly emotional responses, it is easy for others to manipulate. Empathy also tends to be disproportionate to the situation and does not scale up. Or in other words, it's impossible to feel empathy for anonymous thousands or even millions of people, regardless of how deserving they are. By contrast, sympathy is informed by reason and is therefore more wide-ranging. We can sympathize even with people we do not know or whose specific situation we have never experienced, because we are able to recognize that similar situations would be distressing for us, and that it would both be unjust, both for us and for anyone else that has to suffer through them. So it's funny too, because I just finished reading a communication book called Verbal Judo, and in that he talks a lot about empathy and how you communicate through empathy. So it was very timeless or timely that this was the lesson as I was reading that, and trying to think about that in the other sense, that sympathy and empathy aren't really dissimilar. It's just, to use Amy's point, it's the view from above, whereas empathy is like the close-up view.
Right. Well, I liked how, he did a good job, or they did a good job in here kind of distinguishing sympathy. We think that we're supposed to be more empathetic. And yes, I mean, it's, to your point, it's communicating through empathy. But what they talk about is when you empathize, you are actually sharing in the emotional experience that someone else is having. Versus with sympathy, you can care for and you can feel sorry for their situation, but it's not feeling it at that depth of level. Like, I love the example, the quote that I think it's Epictetus. Yeah, it's the quote that Epictetus has at the front, where he basically uses the comparison of, if you were at someone else's house and a servant broke a cup at your friend's house, you would go, oh, well, that happens. That happens. It happens. But if it was your house and a servant broke your cup, you would take it much differently normally. And what this encourages is to really take that, remove yourself that one step, that outsider view, and be able to view it the same way and say, oh, well, it happens.
The cup is still broken.
Well, it's removing your emotional attachment to the situation and treating both situations as the same. Whether it was your cup or it was your friend's cup, view it as if it was your friend's cup, not necessarily as yours.
Yeah, and that's the part too where he says, in the normal course of events, we tend to self-empathize. This is on page 27. Alas, miserable I am. Whereas we sympathize with others, such is the lot of man.
Yeah.
The difference stems from our capability for more balanced judgment when the event does not touch us directly. So reminding ourselves that difficult things happen and not just to us is comforting, was another part that he made there on 20.
I like that they actually outlined, they talked about how the root of empathy and sympathy both have the same root of the Greek word pathos, which means emotion.
Yes.
And I found that interesting how they outlined the distinction, and I underlined sympathy, to care for and feel sorry about another's grief or misfortune. To empathize, you share another's experiences on an emotional level. In my perspective as a yoga teacher and somebody who's a lot with the crunchy world, is I know a lot of people who are self-proclaimed empaths. And a lot of what they discuss is the fact that they feel things so strongly for other people that they go through these huge roller coaster of emotion because they take on other people's grief so deeply. And so I kind of thought about it from that perspective too. It's like, how can you kind of pull back a little bit enough to say like, okay, I get your grief, but not become drowning in it. You know, that view from above, it was like being able to, you know, you think about how if you're going to pull somebody out of a frozen river, you know, if you jump in, you'll both sink. You'll both become underwater. If you have to anchor somehow to the ground, offer something to extend to help pull them out, that's the only chance that you've got to save someone. I liked how they separated it out. And I also underlined makes us more reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
That's what helped me touch back to the Stoic aspect, was to be more reasonable. Basically, not that you're not going to feel things, but manage it and reason through it. You know,
Right.
in my house, as you know, with a 5-year-old, we have a lot of what we label big feelings. And the big feelings are not wrong, but don't get so stuck in the big feelings that you can't function and do your job. We say with cult, you know, you have a job to do, like you have to eat dinner or you have to clean up your room. Like that's your job. So don't get so stuck in the feeling that your job can't happen. The reason, touching it back to reasonable, make us more reasonable. How do you process that?
The clear eyes, right? Go in it with clear eyes. And that's where I think sometimes Stoicism can get a bad rap, because people, when they hear a word like detachment, practice detachment, they think it's cold and unfeeling. And that's not what it means. It doesn't mean you just are indifferent to everything that's happening outside of your realm of control. It's just that you're able to your point, Sierra, reasonably see and separate what is happening from the emotion. You can still feel sorry for it. You can still recognize that this must be difficult for an individual, but you don't have to take on, or to your point, dive into or carry the bucket with them, you know, as they're trying to navigate through it. And that's where, you know, if it's something that you are personally experiencing, being able to take that step back and view it from a completely objective or not even objective, but just a third person. It's not you, it's not the other person, it's just a third person observer. You know, you think about books that you've read in the past, and a lot of them are told in the third person because it's just someone who's observing what's happening around them, and you're able to better discern the thing from the emotion that is tied to it. I loved this exercise. I thought it was awesome.
What did you write down? What did you exercise on? What's the exercise first and foremost?
So the exercise was really doing just that, almost being like an author chronicling the life of someone else, but looking at it from a situation. So if you have a problem that is weighing on you, or that was weighing on you, or a worry that you have for, say, something coming up in the future, journal about it, but write to yourself as the third person. You know, address it as, Amy, I know that you're feeling this way about blah. Or, you know, or basically saying, you know, use second person pronouns. So it's not I, it's you. It's not me, it's Amy. And so I think really being able to do that and do this exercise, I actually said, you know, I started doing this every night, actually, just as part of my nightly Stoic reflection. I started incorporating this just as a reflection of something that either I experienced that day or something that I was anticipating the next day I did this. And I felt that it was really, really helpful just to have that clear eyes, that perspective of, you know, separate yourself, separate the emotion from it, and just document it. Give yourself advice as a third person. And I thought it was great.
Like the Alice in Wonderland quote that we talked about, right?
Yeah.
Remember
exactly.
you said that I give other people very good advice.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember you said, Amy, like, but I have a hard time taking my own advice. I felt like this exercise played right into that piece.
Yes. Oh, yes. Absolutely.
The example that they used about Robert, you know, they said, you know, from the get-go, Robert is not good at comforting himself. He's always been a person everyone turns to for comfort, but he rarely fails helping others gain perspective, but he has a hard time doing it himself. So I liked in the example, and actually I wrote, when they talked about what he wrote, I wrote this. Yes. I literally was like, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was so, I almost like, I had to stop myself from writing ditto, period.
Yeah, it's funny because even that first sentence in where it says, you may excel at providing comfort, but are you equally good at comforting yourself? I literally wrote in the margin, no. I'm like, nope, none that. So I really liked this.
Yeah. Rob, what about you? What did you, when you were creating the exercise? I know that there's several days worth, but was there one that stood out to you as helpful?
Three kind of stood together as Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Because what happened was Thursday night I decided to write a petition to reopen Arizona, and I was like, I'm going to get people to sign it. Boss signed up on it. You know, it was knowing that I wasn't going to control the decision as to whether or not businesses were going to reopen. But what I wanted to say was, like, there's enough people that support that will take their own measures at hand, so on and so forth. Because the longer this goes on, the worse it is for small businesses. So Thursday I wrote, notice you worked a lot today, up until 9 p.m. Sure, you had an idea and you ran with it, but did you put enough time into you today? If you were truly looking to be bold and take that next step, are you going to have to pay more attention? You are going to have to pay more attention to your time. It's the one major resource you can't get back. So that was my advice on that. So, I mean, that was a day where I started probably working at 10 or 11 and worked all the way up till 9. The next day I wrote, this was Friday. So you started a petition to reopen Arizona. 36 hours, over 2,000 people signed it. Here's what I tell you. Bold move. Way to live outside your comfort zone. However, be careful of the ego attachment to the accolades that have come along with it. And then Saturday, notice you took some arrows as your petition was making the rounds. Here's your reminder, Rob. Not everyone's going to agree with you. Additionally, you can't control how people will react and what they say. To be bold, one must be willing to face scrutiny and criticism, both founded and unfounded.
Good job.
You really found your groove with this exercise.
Yeah.
But it's nice to do it every day, and I you know, next week's ties into it. So, but this week, obviously, the week 5 doesn't, so I have to kind of give myself space to do what Amy's doing and say, okay, what advice would I give myself today?
Mm-hmm.
What'd you do? What can you improve on? You know, what outside perspective do you need to have?
Yeah.
It helped me a ton, just working through that and going, okay, because some of the criticism, which actually we'll talk about more next week, got a little personal, and I was like, I had to reason through why those people were criticizing me and say, okay, that's that next level is, okay, so you got criticized and unfollowed by this person we know in Los Angeles who is obviously doesn't like this idea at all. But we'll get into why next week. But that's why I like this week's exercise, because it sets up going that next step for next week.
Yep.
Wow. I didn't read next week's yet.
Head of the game. Got ahead of the game.
I'll say. I wrote down, I wrote, Sierra is doing so many jobs right now that it often feels overwhelming. So this is a true story. Painted Porch, keeping house, and managing Colt's schoolwork is a lot of work. And then I stepped back and said, but this isn't new or impossible. Remember when you worked multiple jobs and in training and tech week for big scale I used to direct large-scale musical productions.
Mm-hmm.
And at a certain point, I was working in the preschool in the morning. I was going to school to become a yoga teacher, and also running rehearsals for these productions of 100 plus kids from 5 to 18. Mm-hmm. So I let the narrator kind of remind about that time period of juggling. Granted, Mom was not on the docket yet, but do you remember when you were able to manage all of those different jobs? You just need to stay organized and manage time appropriately and stay positive. So
that's awesome.
That helped me to just kind of go back to that. And, I have to kind of play the right balance of multitasking during some parts of the day and then just carving out specific times for other parts of the day. And I had to take my own advice that I gave in the working from home and the family dynamic, where a lot of days we literally write out a schedule, mm-hmm. so that we know that those things that have to happen are not going to fall through the cracks. And believe it or not, I do put on lunchtime, make dinner time, eat dinner time. I put a lot of things on this schedule, and there's times where it feels really nerdy to me and like something I never would have done before, but it helps me to stay on top of everything and not just feel like I'm drowning.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
absolutely.
Awesome.
But it's nice to have that perspective, right? And it's almost like you give yourself permission to have the perspective and go, number one, it's okay to feel overwhelmed. Number two, you've done it before. If you step back and be like, you handled it before, you can handle it now. And then you come up with, okay, what's this potential solution? All right, if I schedule things, it looks less overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and when you can see it too.
Yeah.
There was also things that like I had to shift around, like I normally would do the laundry on Saturdays. Well, I had a whole lot of things that had to happen on Saturday. So I actually put my reasonable hat on and said, you know what? Nobody's going to be running around naked if laundry happens on Sunday. Mm-hmm. Okay, big deal, but you do have to continue feeding your family or bad things happen.
Mm-hmm. Don't want anybody to get hangry.
Oh, that's the really bad thing.
Mm-hmm. What'd you have? Anything you want to share?
So I'll share one. And I think we even talked about this in our last week, but the one that I said, Amy, I know you're feeling anxious about the progress of your launch, as there's still quite a bit to complete. However, to better help lay out and plan and schedule for it, it may be a good idea to create a task or launch list to help you track progress as well as determine level of effort. We talked about this last week, Sierra, my Post-its that that I'm working on converting into actual manageable, trackable cards, cards on a tracking board to help not just myself, but help all of us be able to better plot where we are against goals.